Video is going to be hollowing and reassembling the solid piece that we built earlier. So I will start the process and then I'll clip the video because I'll do a lot of it off camera. It takes a while to get everything hollowed out, but I want you to see each step of the process. So we've got our solid piece. It's at leather hard on the outside. Now a piece like this that has a small head and a larger body, you have to be really careful drying it. So once the head is leather hard, you need to wrap it up in plastic so that the rest of the body will continue to dry. So you don't want things to get too hard. Now when we chop this up in larger sections, you can just use a wire tool. So, and you want to kind of think about what makes sense visually for cutting it up. So definitely right below these hands, I could cut this and let's see, my cut was a little bit off, so I'm just gonna straighten it out a little bit. So I can cut this apart, set this aside, and you've got this big section, and a lot of it is going to be taking it. When you have large things, you don't have to be super delicate at the beginning because you can just cut out the inside. So I'm going to make sure I'm cutting it partially through first and then going all the way through. So I can cut out a large chunk of clay there. And I could keep doing that with the knife until I get closer to the outside. And you can decide how thick you want the walls of this to be. You know, I'd say 1/4 of an inch is probably pretty good. You don't want it to be too thick because if you run the risk of not having well compressed clay and having some air pockets in there that you don't know about depending on the way that you built it. So honestly, the thinner it is, the stronger it is, but you need to be very careful when we're hollowing to not go through if you've got deep grooves or cuts somewhere. So I can take away quite a lot of clay pretty quickly, but you can see the bottom's still quite thick because it flares out. So I'm going to turn it over and start taking away clay that way. And this clay is leather hard, so I can hold it and press against it, but I don't want to go crazy with it because it's still soft. You know, you could still definitely affect the shape if you pressed on it too hard. So I'm just taking away this clay. You can see a lot of it coming out. I mean, building solid is really helpful for certain aesthetic reasons, but it definitely isn't the most efficient use of clay. So it's not, you shouldn't just build everything solid because you can. Use it because you need that technique. So once I get most of this thickness out, I'll switch over to a ribbon tool, like the kind that we trim with, and I can start taking away more delicate amounts of clay, getting into different places that a big knife just can't get into. And my goal is for this whole thing to be really consistent. So as I do this, I want to keep feeling and moving around the piece and pulling away clay and then thinking about it, feeling it, seeing where it's thicker, where it's thinner. And so this takes some time, right? This takes a lot of time if it's a really big piece. People make giant sculptures this way, and it takes them, you know, a couple days to sculpt the thing and several months to hollow it out and compress it. Because much like lots of things in ceramics, after we're done hollowing, after we feel like everything is consistently thick, we then have to recompress all this clay because we've just opened up this whole thing and there's lots of clay that is not compressed at all because of the way we built it, that we need to compress it. If you do not compress this, it is going to crack apart. It just will. So make sure you do know that and you don't skip that step, because all of your other work will be for nothing as your piece will crack. So when I feel like everything is consistent thickness, I'm feeling around, taking away clay, I then need to start compressing this clay. And I like to start with just my finger to try to smooth out any of those marks that I have made. And then after I use my finger, I'm going to find different tools. Tools, depending on what you're hollowing out, you might need different tools. Your finger works really well and it can definitely compress because I'm not removing any clay. I'm just pushing it into itself. You might need to find a rib or the end of your wooden knife or something else that had maybe like a soft rounded shape. Like you could use the end of the rubber nib tool, or the rubber nib tool themselves work really well for this. So you need to, this is a long process, and depending on the stage of dryness and how long it's taking, you should have the other part wrapped up when you're doing this. And as you finish each section, you want to wrap them up so that they're not sitting out and getting drier and drier waiting for the rest of the piece. So I'll need to finish compressing this whole piece. I want to wrap it up in plastic when I'm not using it, especially for an extended period of time. So same thing with these big sections here. I can cut them into pieces. I probably, especially when it comes to the arms, if I cut this here, I'll definitely still need to cut that piece in half this way to make sure I get into all these crevices, right? Because I need to get into the arm thickness. So I need to think about where I'm cutting. And I also want to make sure I'm cutting in something that's aesthetic. Generally speaking, your seams will be gone if you do it right, but you don't want to cut someplace unnecessarily. So when I cut this, I'm probably going to, I'm going to use an X-Acto knife here to start these lines, and then I'll cut through it with the wire tool. So I'm going to cut this person's head off. And set that wire. The wire can be a little bit hard to manage, and so we don't want to just use the wire when we care about where it's going to go through. I'll cut their head off, and then I could probably get away with just cutting this body down the middle. Maybe. No, because I won't be able to get to here. So I'm going to have to cut this like this, and then I'll have to cut it down the middle. I'm not super concerned about this cut, so I'm just going to use the wire. And then I'm going to pull it from one side instead of both sides. Hold that wire down. And then I'll end up cutting these pieces in half this way and hollowing them out. So you're going to see a clip to the video. I'm going to turn it off and hollow these out so you're not just watching me hollowing for, you know, hours. Maybe it wouldn't be that long for this piece, but it would be a while. And then I'll turn it back on to reassemble these pieces. Okay, so I wanted to show you getting into the shoulder area. You can kind of see that this kind of comes down to a thinner point here, and it's not just a squared off piece, right? So I need to be really mindful of where my thickness is and where it's thinner. And really right here is where it gets really thin. So when I use my tool, I need to be very mindful of that, take it slow, start to take away material. But make sure I'm leaving enough thickness, so I'm cutting through there. Make sure I'm leaving enough thickness on all the sides that I'm not going to bust through or make a thin spot that wants to crack. So I really have to be careful and slow at certain points, because some of it I could just cut out really quickly, right? There's a lot of extra clay in there. But some of it matters. Some of it I really need to take my time and stop and feel the thickness from multiple times. Use what I can to get in there to feel where the clay is and where I still need to remove some clay. And then always, of course, once you feel like you have a pretty consistent thickness, you need to recompress the inside of this with your hands at first, with tools. If you can't get to it, try to be very careful not to disrupt your actual cut edges so that they can go back together in a clean way. So you can see it's kind of a more intricate shaping than the first one I showed you. I'll turn the camera back on when I do the head as well, so I can show you cutting something a bit smaller. Okay, so I am just finishing up hollowing out and compressing the head of my sculpture. So I got all that clay out of there. Here's my giant pile of clay that I pulled out of the sculpture. And these are nice and compressed now. And I need to reattach these together. So I used an X-Acto knife to cut the head apart because I wanted to make sure I had a nice clean line. So I'm going to go ahead and put this back together, and I want to be careful with my slipping and scoring. Obviously I want it to get nice and gummy, but I don't want to like wreck the outside surface. So I'm going to lean more towards the inside with this than the outside. So I'm going to slip and score both the sides. And score again. So when I put these pieces back together, I want to sort of put it together generally, and then I start at one, I'll pick a place, maybe an important place, and I want to compress that area. And I want to see that kind of squish out along the seam so I know it's together properly. And we want to look at the edge, make sure that's together. Then we'll kind of follow the seam back and press those together. And if you hit this at the right consistency, that leather hard consistency, sometimes when we hollow out, our piece gets a little bit off, but because it's still at leather hard, you can compress it back together and it'll still go back to the right spot. So even if your piece deformed just a little bit, you don't have to worry about it too much. So I've got my piece together, and when I put a piece together, I want to then take my finger or a rib, And I want to remove the really wet stuff from the seam and recompress that. And depending on how fine the details are that you're cutting through, you'll want to let the piece get a little bit harder. You don't want to press on really hard on an area that has a really lot of fine, minute detail, because you'll get rid of your detail. So you have to wait a little bit. Like this hair has a specific texture that I don't want to get rid of. So I'm not going to press super hard, but I'm going to kind of take away the soft stuff, because the stuff around it should be harder than that. And as it dries, you'll probably want to go back and recompress those seams so that they don't reappear. So now I've got my head and my hollowed out head, and I have already had my body here that I had wrapped up. And I haven't compressed all the seams yet, but you can see it's hollow out. And I've compressed it, and I'm going to, so usually I would have, as I attached each section together, cleaned up these seams, but I wanted you to see where I cut everything, so I left them. And you can see that I cut down the center, and I cut here, and I had that cut that you saw before at the bottom. But generally speaking, as you attach each piece, you clean up those seams so that you catch it right when it's really soft. I just left it so you could see it. So I've attached those all together, and I'm going to attach my head now. So you saw me attach the two pieces, and now we're going to attach our head onto our shoulders. Looks like the edges have gotten a little bit curled, but that's okay. We can compensate for that. We can fix it. So I'm going to cut this, or I'm sorry, I'm going to slip and score this neck. And I'm going to set this head on here and sort of line it up. Things may have shifted a little bit, so it might have to be shifted around. I can kind of see a little bit better on the hair. It gives me a little bit more of an indication of where the thing needs to be. And compressor on there. And when you feel like you've got it all lined up, you can go back in and smooth out those seams. Again, you can start with your finger, move to a rib, or a rubber nib tool is very helpful in this situation. Sometimes, like I was saying, if it's leather hard, it might have moved just a little bit, and you can kind of compress that back in. The hair, again, has that specific texture, so we want to try to not lose it. So we'll be a little careful around that as we try to work that seam back together. And you could go back in with a different tool and kind of reestablish some texture if it gets lost. Because your piece is still leather hard, you have the ability to do that. It's not too dry where you couldn't do that. So there is that piece that I made solid and we hollowed out, and so now is compressed on the inside and consistent thickness and considerably lighter. And we'll just, I would finish up all the seams, do any detailing, and then let it dry slowly. So I'd probably throw a cloth over this and let it dry when I was finished with it, because those seams need time to equalize and need time to dry more slowly so they don't form cracks. So that is putting back together.